Ethan Carter pulled his coat tighter around him, bracing against the biting wind as he stepped out of the cafe and into the swirling snow. Denver was locked in the grip of one of the worst winter storms in years. And the city had been transformed into an icy wasteland. Streetlights flickered in the wind, barely illuminating the frozen streets. His breath came in short, visible puffs, his boots crunching against the thick layer of snow that had swallowed the sidewalks. He glanced at his watch. He had exactly 45 minutes to make it across town for the biggest interview of his career. Months of meticulous research, endless calls, and careful maneuvering had led to this moment. A high-profile politician, rumored to be entangled in a web of corruption, had finally agreed to speak with him, an exclusive opportunity that could catapult him into the national spotlight. The storm had made traffic unbearable, but he had mapped out an alternate route. If he kept moving, he could still make it on time. Then he heard it, a faint whimper, nearly lost in the wind. At first, he dismissed it as the groaning of the storm, his mind too occupied with thoughts of what was at stake. But as he took another step, it came again, soft, desperate. He turned his head toward the sound and stopped. Under the flickering glow of a street lamp, a golden retriever lay curled in the snow, her body wrapped protectively around two tiny puppies. The mother's fur was matted with ice, her breath shallow, her limbs trembling. The puppies, barely larger than his hands, huddled against her for warmth, their small bodies shivering violently. Ethan swallowed hard, his heartbeat quickening. He wasn't an animal person. He had grown up in a house where practicality ruled, where time wasn't wasted on sentimentality. His parents had drilled into him that success came from discipline, from never letting emotion interfere with ambition. And he had lived by that. It was why he had clawed his way through the cutthroat world of journalism, chasing down stories that others wouldn't dare touch. He had sacrificed sleep, friendships, and stability for his career. And now, he was on the verge of something monumental. He took another step forward, willing himself to walk away. The mother dog lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. There was no pleading in him, just a quiet, unyielding resolve. She wasn't asking for help for herself. She was holding on for them. The weight of that realization settled heavily in his chest. He clenched his jaw. The storm was only getting worse. The longer he stood here, the harder it would be to make it across town in time. If he missed this interview, there would be no second chance, no exposé, no national headlines with his byline. The retriever lowered her head again, curling more tightly around her pups. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Damn it, he muttered under his breath. His fingers were already numb as he reached for his phone, cursing the fact that emergency services were overwhelmed with calls. There was no guarantee anyone would get here in time to help them. He crouched down, his knees sinking into the cold as he peeled off his gloves and gingerly touched the retriever's fur. She flinched but didn't growl. Her body radiated a weak warmth, but he could feel the unnatural stillness in her muscles. She was barely hanging on. If he left them, they wouldn't survive the night. Ethan's breath came out in a frustrated huff as he stripped off his scarf and wrapped it around the shivering puppies. He needed to move fast. Carefully, he slid his arms under the mother dog, surprised by how little resistance she put up. She was lighter than she should have been, her body worn thin from exposure and hunger. As he stood, he tucked the puppies into his coat, feeling their tiny forms tremble against him. He turned on his heel and started moving, his strides quick and deliberate. He wasn't sure where he was going yet. All he knew was that he couldn't leave them here. The cold bit into his skin, the wind pushing against him with every step. The retriever's breathing was uneven, but she remained still in his arms, trusting him completely. His mind raced through his options. He could try to find a vet, but most places would be closed in this storm. His apartment was closer, but he had nothing there, no blankets, no food for them. His only real choice was the animal shelter several blocks away. He had passed it before on his way to work. If he could just get there in time. He adjusted his grip, forcing his legs to move faster. The city was eerily empty, the storm making it nearly impossible for people to be out. His boots slipped on the ice more than once. But he kept going, his pulse pounding in his ears. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to losing his chance at the interview. But he pushed the thought aside. By the time the shelter's dimly lit sign came into view, Ethan's limbs felt like lead. He banged on the door, his voice hoarse as he called out. A few agonizing moments later, the door cracked open, and a woman peered out, her expression wary until she saw what he was carrying. "Oh, my, bring him inside. Quick," she urged, holding the door wide. Ethan stepped into the warmth, the sudden temperature change stinging his skin. He carefully set the retriever down on a padded surface as the woman, probably a vet tech, hurried over. She immediately began checking the mother's vitals, her face tight with concern. "She's exhausted," the woman murmured, "and these little ones." She gently took the puppies from Ethan's coat, wrapping them in thick towels. "They're lucky you found them when you did." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His fingers were still numb, his body aching from the effort. He glanced at the clock on the wall. He had 20 minutes left. The woman looked up at him, her expression softening. "Do you want to stay and see how they do?" He hesitated, his instincts telling him to run, to salvage whatever he could of the interview. But as he looked down at the mother dog, now resting in warmth, her puppies nestled safely against her, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he had chosen something other than his career. And standing there, watching the retriever's chest rise and fall in steady breaths, he realized he didn't regret it. The storm still raged outside. But here, in this small shelter, a quiet warmth spread through him. Maybe he had lost his big break. Or maybe, just maybe, he had found something more important. Ethan Carter tightened his grip around the trembling golden retriever, his coat wrapped snugly around her frail body as the puppies lay cradled in his arms, their tiny bodies still shivering against the cold. The wind howled through the streets of Denver, swirling snow around his boots as he hurried toward his car. His breath came in short, visible bursts, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. He had just abandoned the biggest story of his career, walked away from the exclusive interview that could have cemented his place in national journalism. His phone vibrated furiously in his pocket. His editor was calling again. No doubt livid that he hadn't shown up. Ethan ignored it. He knew what he had just thrown away. But at this moment, it didn't matter. As soon as he reached his car, he carefully placed the mother dog in the passenger seat, her weak body curling instinctively around her puppies. He cranked up the heat, rubbing his hands together to regain feeling in his fingers. The mother barely stirred, her amber eyes heavy with exhaustion yet filled with something else, trust. She wasn't fighting him, wasn't trying to run. She had accepted his help. And that meant something. He pulled onto the icy road, driving with one hand while the other adjusted the coat around the retriever. The city was nearly deserted, the storm forcing people indoors. Streetlights cast eerie shadows on the snow-covered pavement, their glow flickering against the windshield. His phone vibrated again, and again. He didn't need to look at the screen to know it was his editor, probably demanding an explanation. His stomach twisted. He had spent months working toward this moment, sacrificing everything to secure that interview. And now, he was driving away from it. A deep sigh escaped his lips as he glanced at the dogs beside him. The mother's breathing was slow but steady, and the puppies had stopped shivering as they nestled against her warmth. By the time he reached his apartment, his parking lot was nearly buried under the snow. He killed the engine and carefully lifted the dogs, carrying them inside. The moment the warmth of his apartment hit them, the mother dog let out a small whimper, shifting slightly in his arms. He quickly laid them on a pile of fresh towels in front of the heater, grabbing extra blankets to cover them. The mother sighed, her body finally relaxing, while the puppies curled against her, their tiny paws twitching in sleep. That was when he noticed it. At first, he thought it was just the dirt and ice clinging to her fur. But as he gently pushed back the golden strands, his breath caught scars, faint but unmistakable, crisscrossing her body, hidden beneath her thick coat. Some were old, long-healed, but others were fresh. And then his gaze dropped to the smallest puppy, the one that had been shivering the most. A thin gash ran along its tiny neck. Not deep enough to be fatal, but certainly not an accident. Ethan felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. This wasn't just a case of abandonment. This wasn't a mother dog left behind in the cold by a careless owner. Someone had hurt her. Someone had hurt her puppies. And judging by their condition, someone had left them out there to die. His instincts as a journalist kicked in, his mind shifting from concern to investigation. He reached for his phone, not to call his editor, but to snap photos. He captured the scars along the mother's ribs, the wound on the puppy's neck, the exhausted yet resilient look in the mother's eyes. There was a story here, one bigger than political corruption, bigger than his career ambitions. Who would do this, and why? He sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair as he pieced it together. The mother had clearly been a pet once. Her coat, though matted, had once been well groomed, and her eyes still held the softness of a dog that had known kindness. This wasn't a stray born on the streets. Someone had owned her, and then something had changed. Had she been used for breeding? Had she been discarded when she was no longer useful? Or worse, had she been abused? His jaw clenched. He needed answers. He glanced at the small tag still barely clinging to the mother's collar. Its edges rusted. He carefully turned it over, his pulse quickening as he read the faded engraving. A name. Maggie. It was something. A place to start. Ethan quickly searched online for missing pet reports, scanning through listings as he jotted down notes. But nothing came up for a golden retriever named Maggie, not in Denver. Not in the surrounding towns. If she had once belonged to someone, they hadn't reported her missing. Or maybe they didn't want to be found. He exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering over his phone screen. He could call the local animal shelter, report her condition, but something in his gut told him there was more to this story. If he handed Maggie over too soon, the truth might get buried. His gaze drifted back to the retriever, now resting peacefully with her puppies. She had fought to keep them alive in the brutal cold. Despite her own failing strength, she had endured pain, hunger, and fear, yet she had never abandoned them. Ethan had always believed that the best stories were the ones that exposed the truth. The ones that held people accountable. And maybe, just maybe, this was the story he was meant to tell. His phone buzzed one more time. His editor. He let it go to voicemail. This story wasn't over, and this time, he wasn't walking away. Ethan Carter sat at his kitchen table, his laptop open, the screen illuminating his face in the dimly lit room. Maggie and her puppies rested on the blankets near the heater, their breathing steady, the rise and fall of their small chests bringing him an unexpected sense of calm. But his mind was anything but calm. He had spent the last hour combing through missing pet reports, animal cruelty cases, and anything he could find on abandoned dogs in Denver. What he had uncovered so far painted an ugly picture. This wasn't just neglect. It was something worse. His fingers hovered over his phone before he finally dialed the number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Ethan, it's late. Everything okay?" Dr. Lisa Monroe sounded groggy, but the concern in her voice was immediate. She had known Ethan long enough to recognize when something wasn't right. "I need your help," he said, glancing toward Maggie. "I found a golden retriever and her 2 puppies out in the storm. They were abandoned, but it's more than that. She's got scars, fresh ones and old ones. The puppies have wounds, too. Something's not right." Lisa was silent for a moment. Then her tone sharpened. "Bring 'em in. I'll meet you at the clinic." Ethan didn't waste time. He wrapped Maggie in a blanket and carefully placed the puppies into a small carrier. Then drove through the near-deserted streets to Lisa's veterinary clinic. The snow was still falling, thick and relentless, but his thoughts were racing faster than the storm outside. By the time he arrived, Lisa was waiting at the door, bundled in a heavy coat, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She led him inside, where the warmth of the clinic chased away the lingering cold. Ethan gently placed Maggie on the exam table, watching as Lisa's expert hands moved over her body, pressing lightly on her ribs, lifting her fur to inspect the scars. Lisa exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "These aren't from an accident. She's been restrained for a long time. See these marks?" She pointed to the faint indentations around Maggie's neck and legs. "These are from chains or tight restraints. Probably metal. And the puppies." She moved to the small ones, gently probing their tiny bodies. "These marks on their legs and necks. They've been tied up, too tight, for too long." Ethan clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. "Someone did this to them on purpose." Lisa nodded grimly. "And not just anyone. This kind of treatment. This isn't backyard neglect. This is cruelty. Organized. Calculated." She met Ethan's gaze. "You were right to bring them here." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I need to know who did this." Lisa hesitated. "Ethan, if you start digging, you might not like what you find." He let out a humorlous laugh. "That's usually how it goes." Lisa sighed. "There have been rumors for years. Illegal breeding operations, dogfighting rings. Most of them never make the news because there's never enough proof. But some names have surfaced over and over." Ethan leaned forward. "Who?" She hesitated, then said, "Derek Marshall." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had heard of Derek Marshall before. A wealthy businessman, owner of one of the biggest dog training facilities in the state. Officially, he bred and trained protection dogs, high-end security animals for law enforcement and private buyers. Unofficially, his name had been linked to multiple animal abuse investigations, but nothing had ever stuck. "You think he's involved in this?" Ethan asked. Lisa nodded. "I'd bet my license on it. I've had cases before. Dogs coming in with scars like Maggie's. Puppies with wounds that shouldn't happen in a responsible breeding environment. But whenever reports were filed, they went nowhere. The cases would just disappear." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had chased corruption before, crooked politicians, corporate fraud, but this felt different. This wasn't just about money or power. This was about living creatures suffering in silence, hidden away from public view. "I need more," he said. "If I'm going to expose this, I need proof." Lisa gave him a hard look. "You realize what you're getting into? If Marshall really is running something illegal, he's got people protecting him. People who won't want the truth coming out." Ethan knew she was right. But he also knew that walking away wasn't an option. Not anymore. "I'll be careful," he promised. Lisa sighed. Famous last words. Ethan stayed long enough to make sure Maggie and the puppies were stable before heading back to his apartment. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat down at his laptop, and started digging. Derek Marshall's name came up in old news articles, business reports, even a few animal rights complaints that had been quietly closed without explanation. But as Ethan went deeper, he found the real story hidden in court records and underground forums. Marshall's facility wasn't just training security dogs. There were whispers, hushed conversations in online threads, about illegal dogfighting. About dogs that never made it out of his kennels alive. And every time someone tried to expose him, the evidence vanished. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just animal cruelty. This was organized crime. And he had just stumbled into the middle of it. Ethan Carter adjusted his jacket, the weight of the small recording device pressing against his chest as he walked through the iron gates of Marshall's facility. The bitter stench of urine and filth hit him immediately, mixing with the sharp metallic scent of blood. He kept his expression neutral, masking the disgust curling in his stomach. He had been in dangerous situations before, exposing corporate fraud, bribery, political corruption, but this was different. This was raw, brutal, and cruel. And now, he wasn't just here for a story. He was here for the truth. A large man with a thick beard and cold, calculating eyes greeted him with a grunt. "You the one looking for a guard dog?" Ethan nodded, keeping his voice casual. "Yeah, heard Marshall's got the best." The man smirked and motioned for him to follow. As they walked through the facility, Ethan took in everything. The rows of cages, some barely large enough for the dogs trapped inside, their ribs jutting out beneath scarred fur. Some lifted their heads weakly, their eyes dull and lifeless. Others flinched at any sudden movement, cowering in the corners of their enclosures. The few dogs that still had any fight left in them paced restlessly, their bodies tense, eyes sharp with a mixture of aggression and fear. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. He needed to get footage. He casually brushed his jacket, tapping the hidden camera attached to his shirt button. Every second he spent here was risky, but he had to document everything. The man led him to a large, dimly lit area where the stench of blood was even stronger. The ground was covered in dirt, but here and there, Ethan saw dark stains that hadn't been washed away. A pit, no bigger than a boxing ring, stood in the center, surrounded by crates and stacks of old wooden pallets. Men lingered around it, some smoking, others exchanging cash with murmured bets. A low growl caught Ethan's attention. In the pit, two dogs stood poised to fight, one a hulking pit bull, its body covered in scars, the other a leaner but equally battered shepherd mix. Their handlers held their chains tight, waiting for the signal. Ethan swallowed hard. He had read about underground dogfighting before, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The quiet, sick anticipation in the air, the way the men around the pit leaned in with eager, greedy eyes, it made his skin crawl. Then, a voice cut through the murmurs. "I don't want any more mistakes." Ethan stiffened. The voice was deep, controlled, authoritative. He turned slightly, careful to keep his posture relaxed. At the far end of the room, Derek Marshall stood in the shadows, speaking in a low, measured tone to a man in a dark coat. Ethan edged closer, straining to listen. "The journalist should have been taken care of," Marshall muttered, his voice laced with irritation. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The journalist. His mind raced, every nerve in his body going taut. The interview he had missed. The one he had fought for months to secure. The one he had abandoned because of Maggie. It hadn't been an interview at all. It had been a setup. If he had shown up that night, he wouldn't have walked away. His pulse thundered in his ears. But he forced himself to remain still, his mind working through the implications. Marshall wasn't just an animal abuser or a dog fighter. He was connected to people who had influence. People who could make a journalist disappear. And the politician Ethan had been investigating. It wasn't a coincidence. This entire operation was linked to something bigger. Something deeper. He inhaled slowly, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He needed to get out of here, now. He had seen enough, recorded enough. If he stayed too long, if Marshall or his men caught onto him, he wouldn't get a second chance. Carefully, he stepped away from the pit, nodding to the man who had led him in. "I've seen enough," he said casually. "I'll be in touch." The man eyed him but didn't protest as Ethan walked toward the exit. Every step felt agonizingly slow, but he forced himself to keep the same steady pace, to not give away the fact that his heart was slamming against his ribs. As soon as he was outside the gates, he quickened his stride, his breath coming in short, cold bursts. He climbed into his car, his fingers trembling as he gripped the wheel. He couldn't stay here. He had to get the footage to Lisa, to someone he could trust. He glanced back at the facility, at the rows of caged, broken animals. He had wanted to be a journalist to expose corruption, to tell the stories no one else would. And now, he had the biggest story of his life. But this wasn't just about a story anymore. It was about justice, about stopping something evil before it destroyed more lives. And, in a way, about the dog who had unknowingly saved his. Ethan Carter sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, the cursor blinking at the start of an empty document. The evidence he and Lisa had gathered lay spread out before him. Photos of the scarred and malnourished dogs. Financial records tying Marshall to illegal gambling. And most damning of all, audio recordings from his undercover visit to the facility. His heart pounded as he played back the conversation he had overheard. Marshall's voice low and menacing, speaking about a journalist who was supposed to be taken care of. Ethan knew exactly what that meant. He had narrowly escaped a trap, and in doing so, had stumbled upon something much bigger than a corrupt businessman abusing animals. This was organized crime, and it ran deeper than he had ever imagined. He exhaled sharply, steadying himself. There was no turning back. This was the story he had to tell. Lisa had already contacted the authorities, handing over the medical reports detailing the cruelty the dogs had endured. Ethan had spent the last few nights combing through records, linking Marshall's dogfighting operation to powerful figures. Politicians, businessmen, law enforcement officials, people who had a vested interest in keeping these activities hidden. But now, the truth was out. The evidence was undeniable. The following morning, the police launched a raid on Marshall's facility. Ethan stood just beyond the yellow police tape, his camera in hand as officers moved in, their flashlights cutting through the dim morning fog. The front gates were forced open, revealing rows of filthy cages, the stench of neglect wafting into the cold air. Some dogs were too weak to react. Others cowered in fear. A few barked hoarsely, their voices rough from years of suffering. Ethan watched as officers entered the back rooms, emerging moments later with stacks of ledgers, computers, and folders filled with transaction records. He knew what those contained: bets placed on illegal fights, payouts to high-profile clients, and, most chillingly, payments to keep certain officials quiet. Then came the moment Ethan had been waiting for. Derek Marshall, clad in his usual dark coat, was led out in handcuffs. His face was unreadable, but when his gaze landed on Ethan, something shifted. A smirk, cold, knowing. "You have no idea who you just messed with," Marshall muttered, his voice low but firm. Ethan didn't flinch. He met Marshall's gaze head-on. "Yeah, well, now the whole world knows." Marshall's smirk didn't fade as he was shoved into the back of a squad car. But Ethan saw something beneath the arrogance: anger, fear. A man who thought he was untouchable, now realizing that wasn't true. The fallout was swift. Ethan's article, meticulously detailed and backed by undeniable evidence, made national headlines. News stations picked up the story, broadcasting footage from the raid, showing the horrific conditions the dogs had been rescued from. Public outrage exploded, flooding social media, demanding justice. Activist groups rallied, pressuring lawmakers to tighten laws against dogfighting and animal cruelty. Politicians who had once ignored the problem were now scrambling to distance themselves, forced into action by the sheer weight of public demand. Ethan had expected pushback, threats, attempts to discredit his work, but instead, something surprising happened. His story resonated. It wasn't just another expose, it was a catalyst for change. His career skyrocketed, not because he had taken down a powerful businessman, but because people cared, because, for once, cruelty that had been hidden for so long was now impossible to ignore. But even with his professional success, the thing that mattered most to him was much smaller, much quieter. Bella and her puppies had stayed with him throughout the investigation. At first, he had told himself it was temporary, just until the case was resolved, just until they found the right home. But as the weeks passed, he stopped making excuses. They belonged with him, and he with them. One morning, as he opened the door to his backyard, Bella hesitated at the threshold. The wind carried the scent of freedom, of a world beyond fences and walls. For a moment, Ethan feared she would run, that the damage done to her was too deep to undo. But instead, she turned her head, met his eyes, and stepped closer. Slowly, gently, she pressed her head against his hand. A silent thank you, a sign of trust. Ethan smiled, his fingers running through her fur. He had set out to save them, but the truth was, they had saved him too. In the relentless pursuit of stories, of truth, he had nearly lost himself. But Bella had reminded him of something simple yet profound, that sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change everything. And in that moment, Ethan knew his life had changed forever.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.